2025 taxes in Canada. It's a crazy space. We've had a wild 9 years of tax changes and tax updates.
The economy is sluggish in Canada, with overall growth of just 1% in the fall quarter and not much better in the final month of the year. Accounting for population growth, the economy contracted.
We're going to have a great conversation with a tax specialist. We're joined by Kim Moody, who is a founder of Moody's Private Client Law, as well as Moody's Tax.
We're seeing so many successful people leaving Canada.
Economic migrants who were chosen by the government to come to Canada are leaving the country in record numbers.
Real, authentic leadership that this country needs right now.
We need to bring down personal tax rates.
This onerous taxation is just absolutely ridiculous.
Many, many times over the years, saying that I'd love to see a fulsome tax reform commission. The last time we had that was in 1962 to 1966. It took 4 years, to study it and recommend, and then those recommendations that were released in 1966 were controversial at the time, but ultimately a good chunk of those recommendations, not all of them, and some were modified, but were put into major tax reform that got implemented January 1 of 72 by Trudeau Sr. And so that's the last time that we've had major tax reform. I'd like to see a major tax reform version 2, but I just don't see it. We need to bring down personal tax rates. Our personal tax rates are way too high. Will they ever be as low as the United States? Probably not, because we're smaller and we don't have the same leverage. But can we bring down a lot of the tax rates on the back of, spending reduction? I think so. I think we can make some good progress there.
I would agree.
And also just increased economic performance. We can make that work. What that number is, I don't know, because I'm not an economist, but I certainly want to see what it looks like. So I think personal tax rate reductions is high on the priority list. And then I tend to think that we're going to have to see corporate reform in some form or fashion, because the United States is, they went through major tax reform in 2017-18 in DJT version 1, and DJT version 2 is wanting to do some more. And so I think we're going to need to see a real response this time, not like we saw during Bill Morneau's tenure, which was just pathetic. And then so I suspect we'll see some sort of corporate reform, and I suspect at the end of the day that we're going to see a lot of elimination in an attempt to simplify the existing Income Tax Act, because it is bloody complicated. What do I think people should expect in the next 5 years for tax? I think a simplification. I think a more common sense approach to tax, a more prudent public policy perspective in tax, and tied to all that, a simpler administration. I'd love to see a system where we have people that don't need to pay tax preparers to file their tax returns. There's not many accountants that like to do tax returns, first of all, because it's so monotonous and boring. And to see these low-end tax preparers like H&R Block and what have you, I probably shouldn't have mentioned by name, but charge people $100, $200, $500 to do simple tax returns. It just drives me crazy. It does our country no good. And so we need to get to a much simpler way to file our tax returns and administer our system better. And frankly, on that point, Richard, in my client base, our firm's client base, we're seeing so many successful people leaving Canada. And I've rang this alarm bell for years, because it's, they need our help, but is it the kind of help that we want to give? No, we're I'll speak for myself. I don't want to speak for my colleagues, but I'm a very, very proud Canadian. I'm very proud of this country, and to see those successful people leaving on the back of my advice is disappointing. It's intellectually stimulating and challenging and rewarding, but it's so bad for our country. And the number of people that we've seen. I'll give you a little test here, Richard and Jayson. So in the first 23 years of my career, I had about a dozen departure tax files, as we call them in our industry, people that leave Canada. So whenever you leave Canada, become a non-resident, you're deemed to have disposed of all of your assets at fair market value. So in the first 23 years of my career, roughly, I had about a dozen of them. and mostly grandma and grandpa wanting to live in the States or, somewhere exotic, better weather, better healthcare, or being close to family. Something, it was never tax driven. Fast forward to when Little Prince became, prime minister, and all of a sudden the first thing he did was increase personal tax rates for the so-called wealthy, and then they went after private businesses in 2017, and then the out of control spending with COVID and constant leaks of, hey, are we going to have a wealth tax? Just all these things during COVID that they were testing, a wealth tax, and the modern monetary theory of economics looks like it works until it doesn't, with inflation. And, and so, the continued pile on and, a tax on real estate, the so-called flipping tax, the prohibition of deductions on short-term rentals, which is one of the most ridiculous policies I've ever seen in my entire career.
We want you to understand the 5 strategies that you can use to reduce taxes now and in the future. In fact, we wrote about them in our book, Keep Taxes Away from Your Wealth. You can get a copy of Keep Taxes Away from Your Wealth by going to keeptaxesaway.com. That's keeptaxesaway.com. Ease on over there, get a copy today.
All those things add up. So you want to take a guess at how many files I've had?
Oh,
600. Over
Oh, my
600
God.
files. And we're a small firm. We're about 80 people. We're not big four. We're not, big law, where we have hundreds and hundreds of people. Now we're pretty niche. We advise the, the high net worth, ultra high net worth, private families across Canada. But to have 600 files, now, not to be, to be honest though, not all of those 600 have closed. I would say probably a little more than half of them have closed. But the wealth attached to those, to those ones that have closed is high billions, right? And when you think about that leaving Canada, and the sucking sound, as Ross Perot said, and you guys talked about, how many average Canadians, if you want to call it that, or immigrants to Canada, does it take to replace even one successful Canadian leaving? A lot. And let's just call it the other 300, the other half that didn't close. Again, the wealth around those are massive. Are they still keen? Well, yeah, they are. But I always tell clients that CRA is your, the tax man is your partner in your life. And I think generally people, and I'll speak for myself, I think, taxation in any form is the price you pay for a stable society, infrastructure, minimal healthcare, minimal education, taking care of the vulnerable, et cetera. I have no problem with tax. I get accused by some lefties that think that I'm on the zero tax train. I'm not. I'm much more reasonable and centrist than that. I happen to be a lot more vocal though than the average person because I think when you assess the value you're getting for your dollars, the value that Canadians have had has been atrocious. Like, do we have a great healthcare system across all provinces? No, it's atrocious. And it's getting worse. Do we have a good education system? No. My youngest son, graduated grade 12 about 2 years ago now. When he was in grade 10, he came home with, the privilege wheel. I had no idea what a privilege wheel was. But when you go around the wheel and you look at, are you white? Are you Christian? Are you, blah, blah. Do you live in a home? Apparently he was towards the center and very privileged, and therefore he had to acknowledge his privilege. That motivated me to start a think tank called the Aristotle Foundation, to push back at shit like that. I hope I'm allowed to say that. And the Aristotle Foundation, led by our Mark Milkey, is an amazing thing. But I'm digressing here. But my point being is that we don't get good value for dollars on infrastructure and on what's being provided. The amount of CRA auditors that they've hired to do what? To redistribute wealth, to redistribute income. It's almost doubled in the headcount. It's craziness.
Enjoyed this conversation? Watch the full conversation by clicking right here. Or if you want to see more amazing clips just like this, go ahead and click here.